It was too big to be called a sword. Massive, thick, heavy, and far too rough. Indeed, it was a heap of raw iron. These days, massive anime swords are a dime a dozen, but we bet you can't find one with a description as poetic and as accurate as that one. Guts' Dragon Slayer sword might not be the first big sword to be featured in anime history, but it certainly is the one that contributed to the more frequent appearances of inhuman blades in the medium. Sanosuke's Zanbato from Rurouni Kenshin, Zabuza's Kubiriki Bocho from Naruto, even Inuyasha's iconic Tetsuega. All of them were penciled into creation after Kentaro Miura unleashed the Berserk series into the world in 1989. But with that first arc of Berserk came many questions. Who was Guts? What led him to pursue demons and worse things through the endless night? How did his conflict with the God Hand and Griffith/Femto begin? And, most importantly, how in the world does he swing that damn sword around? The Dragon Slayer has looked massive and unwieldy since its debut, yet it's also been used as the most efficient monster killer in the Berserkverse since then as well. What makes it such an effective astral weapon, and how can Guts use it despite its inhuman size and weight? And what is its actual size and weight? We'll answer all that and more in this video. This is the Dragon Slayer Sword's Anatomy, Explored. Who made the Dragon Slayer sword? What was it made for? For a long time, Berserk fans didn't even know who created the iconic sword that has become a major thread in the fabric of Guts' tale. But like most things Miura, he set it up early and paid it off at the most appropriate moment. The Dragon Slayer debuted in the Black Swordsman arc for the readers of Young Animal back in 1989. But canonically, Guts didn't get it until like chapter 94 of the series. This is because the Black Swordsman arc was basically a flash forward, and Miura decided to fill in the details as he crafted the Golden Age arc. We meet the creator of the Dragon Slayer in chapter 48, only we don't know it yet. For the entire year that Guts was away from the Falcons, he was up in the mountains of Midland, training alone old school style. Well, not strictly alone because he had the help of a father-daughter duo. Guts trained at a waterfall near the hut and mine of the aged blacksmith Godot. Godot's daughter Erica helped him with his training sessions and patching him up afterwards. And Godot would often spend his days working on swords he had just made for Guts once again, because this guy went out and tried to cut logs falling from a waterfall with them. Chapter 48 is more of a breakdown of Guts' moment of revelation about his dream, and Godot only plays an assisting role in that. Once, after his training sessions, Guts asked Godot why he was a blacksmith, and his answer was that it was all he had known since he was a child. And by the time he thought of doing anything else, he had grown old. But if he had to pick one reason for continuing on the path of the blacksmith, it would be the fleeting sparks that his hammer makes every time he gives shape to steel. Godot sees life in those moments, and Guts realizes it's the same for him. Except his sparks come from the clashing of swords on the battlefield. This moment fills him with new resolve to continue fighting opponents stronger than himself because the way of the sword was his path, and his destination was to become the greatest. He doesn't say it in so many words. Guts is humble if nothing else, but it's clear that his desire to constantly fight more challenging opponents is driven by his internal desire to become strong enough to stand next to Griffith as an equal, not in his shadow as an inferior. It's a beautiful conclusion to what was, up until that point, quite a harrowing character arc. But we thought that would be the extent of Godot's impact on the story when we were first reading Berserk. Little did we know how wrong we were. Following the eclipse, Skull Knight brings Guts, Casca, and Rickert with him to a safe location, a cave that used to be inhabited by elves. Turns out, it's also Godot's ore mine, which brings our favorite blacksmith back into the series, just like that. After Guts goes through his first night as a branded individual and declares unending war on all of demonkind, he asks Godot for some gear for his fight. Godot gives him his iconic black armor, Rickert patches up a prototype steel prosthetic arm and fits it with a crossbow for Guts, and the master blacksmith also gives him a sword. However, this isn't the Dragon Slayer. At first, Godot gives Guts a rather ordinary one-handed longsword. It looks a bit like Skull Knight's in terms of its blade design, minus the thorns, and it's good enough to cut through an apostle's flesh, but not good enough to cleave through their entire bodies. Guts ends up getting thrown about a bit by a hound apostle, and he counters with the cannon that was hidden inside of his new arm, but he realizes he needs something bigger to get the job done. That's when he sees it, lying in the corner of Godot's now broken storage shed, the Dragon Slayer. Turns out, back when Godot was still a young blacksmith, he was quite famous. His blades were given patronage by some of the highest nobles in all the land, but Godot was getting pretty frustrated with their requests for blades that were more intricate and more refined. He felt as though his work was losing its meaning by paying attention to such frivolous details. The primary job of a sword is to cut through its enemy, and refined, ornate blades can seldom accomplish that, no matter what Game of Thrones tries to sell you. So when the king sent out a proclamation for a sword fit to butcher a dragon, Godot decided to take up the challenge and create the weapon as described. The result was the Dragon Slayer, a massive hulking behemoth of a sword that couldn't be lifted by a single knight in the kingdom, but was fit for butchering a dragon according to its creator. Naturally, the king was pissed with Godot for creating such an outlandish weapon, and he sent out people to hunt him down so he could punish him. Godot ran to the mountains, which is where he stayed throughout his entire association with Guts. Godot recounts this tale to Rickard and his daughter Erica with a rather sneaky grin stuck on his face, so we can't be sure how true that last part is. But the first one is true enough because Guts uses the Dragon Slayer to bifurcate the Hound Apostle in two and chastise Godot for holding out on him, but not in that order. The fact that Guts could even lift it is a jaw-dropping miracle for Godot because of the inhuman build of the Dragon Slayer's sword, which we'll now get into. What is the size and weight of the Dragon Slayer? What is it inspired by? A lot of people ask the question, is the Dragon Slayer the one that made big swords such a massive part of anime and manga for the last 3 decades? And the answer is both yes and no in a way. If you're someone who only watches anime, you might have seen other shows featuring big blades before Berserk 1997, but you have to remember that the series was in publication for 8 years by that point. The only reason Berserk didn't get an anime for a long time was because of its controversial nature, which makes sense because even the 1997 version cuts out the craziest stuff from Miura's dark fantasy masterpiece. But the Dragon Slayer itself was based off of other big swords that Miura had seen in mangas like the Guin Saga and Pygmalion. So there has always been a precedent for unwieldy blades being wielded by unwitting blade wielders, but the reason why Dragon Slayer is looked at as the OG big blade is because it's the first one that gave careful consideration to the actual ramifications of creating a blade as big as that. Most other big swords up until this point were being wielded single-handed, with no effort made by the people who were using them. Miura found this to be a rather unrealistic portrayal of such a massive weapon, so he decided to go against the grain with his own. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get into breaking down the specifics of the Dragon Slayer. For starters, the blade is composed of an iron ore that Godot finds in those elfin caves we talked about earlier. It's about as tall as Guts in length, grip included, and our best estimate is that Guts' height comes out to about 6'3". This puts the Dragon Slayer's height at 190 centimeters, or just about 2 meters, which is around the average length of a German two-handed greatsword. But what actually makes Guts' sword a problem to wield for most men is its width and enormous weight. The base of Guts' sword must be the size of the two-hander's crossguard, except the Dragon Slayer does not have a crossguard, it's 1.5 feet of pure death. The way Godot made this sword is simply different from any other sword in the series. The hilt of Dragon Slayer is pretty much the same as that of any regular sword, which is why it can fool you into thinking you can take Guts on when he keeps it under his cloak. But from that point onward, its craftsmanship is simply inhuman. The base has a semicircular reinforcement that serves as the foundation of the whole thing. The structure also has a hook on it for Guts to hang the sword around his body, as sheathing Dragon Slayer is practically impossible. The base extends beyond the semicircle on both sides of the sword, and it tapers towards the tip at a sharp angle towards the end, making it a far flatter blade than you'd imagine. In the prototype, the base was even wider, and it actually looks somewhat like a crossguard by itself, but Miura opted for a simpler design for his end product. We have to say that it worked out pretty well because the Dragon Slayer is iconic for its simple yet deadly nature. As for the weight of the sword, you will find lots of wild numbers out there floating around on the internet, but our best estimate is it's somewhere between 100 to 150 kilos. We came to this range not because of any kind of hyper-scientific formula or anything, we just made some educated guesses. The average human being can lift about 50 kilos of heavy weight at best on the factory floor, according to most labor laws, and considering that it took 2 holy iron chain knights to bring Dragon Slayer into their camp after they caught Guts, that puts the weight of Dragon Slayer around 100 kilos, if not more. Now, considering that these guys are the pretty boy knights and they did have armor on when they brought it in, we could say the range likely falls somewhere between 80 to 120 realistically, but we'll cut them some slack given this is still a fantasy story above all. Any number that comes close to 200, 300, or God forbid 400 kilos is just something you guys shouldn't even entertain because otherwise Guts' capture by the Holy Iron Chain Knights wouldn't even make any sense if just 2 of them could casually lift 200 kilos of weight and transport it as if they were half Thor doing a boulder run. This does make the Dragon Slayer far heavier than any kind of sword, and it's the main reason why it's considered to be so unwieldy. It's so big that Guts has to sling it across his back when he travels with it, but that could also have something to do with the inspiration for his character. Miura specifically wanted to create a Japanese swordsman with a gimmick on his left arm and a giant sword for his story, and it just so happens that samurais were accustomed to using a sword quite similar to Dragon Slayer back in the day. Called an odachi, these massive 2-meter plus swords were mostly ceremonial in nature, similar to bearing swords from Europe, but they were used by samurais for a brief period of time. They were so huge that they had to be slung across the back, which is probably where Miura got the idea for his character in the first place. If you think about it, Guts is a lot like a wandering samurai, going from one place to another, fighting the strongest available challengers, and all the while polishing his sword skills and giving out sage advice on how to live his life to his companions. But now that we have the finer details out of the way, let's get into how Guts handles the sword and what it usually means for his opponents. How deep does the Dragon Slayer cut? How durable is it? How does Guts even lift it? Because of its sheer size and weight, the Dragon Slayer doesn't function like a regular sword. Rather, it's more akin to a bladed maul, which makes your best strategy against this sword strict avoidance because contact will most certainly mean death. While a lot of it has to do with how Guts uses the sword, which we'll get to in a bit, credit certainly has to be given to the Dragon Slayer's build. The sword is thick and sharp enough to cut horses as well as fully grown men in full-sized plate armor in half, often at the same time. In fact, Guts has even used the Dragon Slayer to cut through pillars effortlessly, which just goes to show you that this isn't a question of how deep the Dragon Slayer cuts, but rather what is deep enough. This cutting power, coupled with the range of the Dragon Slayer, makes it a veritable death sentence for anyone that comes across it, and Guts has at least 2 other ways to amplify both. This is where the question of how Guts lifts the Dragon Slayer in the first place becomes relevant. Well, to put it simply, Guts has been lifting oversized swords since he was literally 6 years old. He held his first training sword at 6, his first longsword at 9, and was using a greatsword as early as 15. That's a progression of 1 kilo to 1.5 kilos to 2 kilos or more in a very short span of time. From the moment he learned he needed to defend himself on the field of battle to survive, Guts developed a routine of swinging his sword 100 or more every day until he perfected every aspect of swordplay. He's been doing this since he was 6, ladies and gentlemen, and most of Guts' physique is pure muscle. He can easily lift his own body weight, which is estimated to be around 120 kilos, at least once over by the time he becomes an adult and finds Dragon Slayer. This, as well as the fact that he was being driven by pure malice, makes lifting something as unwieldy as Godot's masterpiece a reality for a guy like Guts, who once killed 100 men by himself and shook it off with a nap. That's not to say that his new gear doesn't help him in maneuvering his massive iron heap of a sword. For starters, you will see Guts wield Dragon Slayer single-handed occasionally in the series before he gets a certain armor, but he'll mostly be using it two-handed. That's because his left hand, which is the prosthetic steel hand with the hidden cannon, also has a magnetic grip on it. This allows Guts to hold on to Dragon Slayer without worrying about it slipping away from him while he swings it with all his might. There's also the fact that Guts is a master swordsman by the time he gets the blade, which means he can use minimal moves for maximum effect. You'll notice that most of the time he fights in wide arches and makes moves that guarantee his opponent's death. This is the fighting instinct he's developed since being raised on the battlefield from infancy, and the Dragon Slayer is perhaps the only weapon that allows him to fully unleash his potential as a fighter. We've seen Guts use it to block and attack with blinding speed and efficiency in his fight with Zondark, Zod, and countless others. We've seen him use it as a shield against Rosine's elf bug pseudos, Puck, and countless others. But that isn't where the extent of Guts' maneuverability with the Dragon Slayer ends. Let's go back to those 2 ways of amplifying the raw power of the Dragon Slayer we were talking about earlier. The first is with the use of his arm cannon. By mounting the Dragon Slayer atop the arm cannon and then firing it, Guts can attack 2 targets approaching him from both sides at speeds he wouldn't be able to dodge from. When the cannon explodes, Guts turns with it, creating an arc of death that kills anything within a 2-meter radius of Guts based on the Dragon Slayer's angle and height. The second has more to do with the Berserker armor. When Guts uses the Berserker armor to fight his enemies, his body's natural limiters are lifted. Concepts like the weight of a weapon and the pain from his wounds become meaningless once he's consumed by the armor's ode. In this state, he can freely wield the Dragon Slayer with a single hand, and it turns him into a killer beyond comparison. Guts turns into a murderous feral Berserker that keeps bashing into his enemies at the cost of his own bones. Using the Dragon Slayer one-handed not only improves his range of motion, the limit-breaking abilities of the Berserker armor allow him to carve up a monster as large as a Makara like it was a roasted fowl. He could also put a crack into the corundum-scaled skin of Grunbeld in his dragon form while putting only a single dent into the Dragon Slayer in this state, which is a testament to both weapons' respective craftsmanship. In fact, this brings us to the last point of discussion for this section, which is its durability. Trust us when we say the Dragon Slayer is perhaps the best weapon ever smithed in the history of Berserk. Godot must have used some elf magic magic-laced iron to make this thing because it's durable beyond imagination. In its first 2-year stint with the Black Swordsman, the Dragon Slayer suffered many nicks and signs of wear and tear, but it didn't sport a single chipped edge or significant breach to its main body. This is after Guts basically put it through unimaginably torturous situations for metal specifically, such as frequent explosions, dissecting buildings and bodies, using it to save little girls from falling to their deaths, etc. After being reforged by Godot right before his demise, it's like the blade has taken on its creator's spirit and has now become unbreakable. During the fight against Grunbeld, Guts ends up twisting and breaking multiple limbs whilst attacking the Flame Dragon Knight's apostle form. As we already told you guys, Grunbeld's skin is made out of corundum in that state. What we didn't tell you is that it's the 3rd hardest mineral in the world, and the fact that Dragon Slayer was repeatedly slammed into it like a bladed hammer and came out without a dent, it's practically a miracle. Even as recently as chapter 374, the blade actually looks pretty alright, even though Guts clearly isn't. It's been through countless fights with apostles, including Ganishka's lightning, and it's weathered the guts of a literal sea god, but no sign of damage appears to be on the blade. Which brings us to our next question. Is the Dragon Slayer alive? How can it damage astral beings? We were just kidding about Godot's soul still being alive within the Dragon Slayer, but there does seem to be some kind of magical property attached to it because Godot's greatest weapon is also the only human-made weapon shown to be 100% effective on astral creatures. In the roughly 3 years that Guts has had it, the Dragon Slayer has bathed in the blood of numerous apostles, pseudo-apostles, restless spirits of the dead, possessed skeletons, you name it. It has cut through so many astral creatures that trying to put a number to it would add insult to injury. So instead, what we'll explain is how it manages to do that. The Dragon Slayer isn't alive, first and foremost. It's not like Elric of Melniborn's Stormbringer. Because the Dragon Slayer has been used to cut through the bodies of so many foul astral creatures, their blood has tempered it to the point where it can now cut through its target's physical and astral bodies, making it one of the most lethal weapons in all of existence. It started with the killing of the Hound Apostle, and has continued ever since, with Guts now residing within the interstice contributing greatly to the same. The restless spirits of the dead are described as having a rubbery, slimy physical existence when Guts' body perceives them. You can only cut through that with something like the Dragon Slayer, and Guts has done it enough times to this point where his weapon now can harm a God Hand member. During Guts' encounter with Slann in Kliphof, he managed to stop her forced advent before it went out of hand by running her through with his sword, which actually killed her physical manifestation. We say this because shortly after, Slann claims she can feel both death and life melding in her womb, which we don't think we need to explain, nor do we want to, honestly. After killing so many apostles and other evil astral creatures, the Dragon Slayer has become adept at harming things from both the physical and astral worlds, which makes it an extremely valuable weapon for those who understand the implications of the same. Which brings us to our final question for this video. Will the Dragon Slayer ever get another upgrade? There are many fan theories floating about on the internet about an upgrade for the Dragon Slayer coming in the current Eastern Exile chapter, and we can't fully dismiss these ideas. Most of them stem from the fact that after Guts couldn't even touch Griffith in Elfhelm, it seems like he'll need a sort of Actuation-esque upgrade to help him get the job done. The general idea is that he'll somehow emulate what Skull Knight does using Becci, and then use those temporal powers to break through Griffith's spatial negation technique, which is probably what's causing Guts to miss all the damn time. But the question we think is more pertinent is, does the Dragon Slayer need another upgrade? It's the pinnacle of blacksmithing within the Berserkverse in our opinion. A massive hulking heap of iron shaped into 6+ feet of pure death, and its exceptional endurance to all kinds of conditions makes it an even bigger marvel. But the Dragon Slayer might not be the answer to overcoming Griffith's spatial negation tech. The key to Guts laying his hands on Griffith hinges not on something physical, but on something emotional, which is mainly his ability to let go of being a part of Griffith's story. We'll be discussing this more in another video that should be dropping on the channel soon, so don't forget to subscribe and turn the notification bell to always, because you don't want to miss that. But here's the premise. Skull Knight compares Griffith post-incarnation to an author who's writing his own story. His power is so immense that those within his story are powerless against him. Only those outside of his story can have any influence on him, which is why we think Pretty Ricky was able to land the pimp slap of the millennium on the Falcon of the Millennium. If Guts can figure out some way to break free from Griffith's story as well, then he should definitely be able to use base Dragon Slayer to slaughter Griffith like a helpless sheep, especially after everything he's done. But if an upgrade is needed, we don't think it will be like the Sword of Actuation, simply because we know that's not the kind of repetition Miura would want in his story, and Studio Gaga and Kujimori give more than a damn about ensuring his legacy remains intact and untainted with their run on Berserk. Marvelous verdict! With all that being said, that's our take on the Dragon Slayer's anatomy, a sword so iconic that everything from Final Fantasy to Elden Ring has copied it. But we've said a lot about Dragon Slayer in this video. What we want to know now is what you guys think about it. Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your fellow strugglers, and we'll see ya in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, fellow strugglers.